In the autumn of 1903, in the hardscrabble country of northern Minnesota, travelers along the rutted county road saw a strange sight. A young man, barely 20, was digging a hole, not a well, not a root cellar. This was a pit, wide and deep, big enough to swallow a wagon. Day after day, through the crisp October air, he worked with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, a solitary figure carving a wound in the earth. The community watched. They thought he'd lost his mind. He had a perfectly good, if small, log cabin just 100 yards away. Why was he digging his own grave? The talk started at the trading post, then moved to the church steps. They said the boy, Silas, had always been a little off. Kicked out of his family home at 17, he'd come back with a young wife and a quiet strangeness about him. Now this. And when the winter of 1903 hit, a winter that would be spoken of in hushed tones for generations, that crazy hole in the ground would prove the difference between survival and surrender. It would become the warmest, driest, most efficient home in the entire county, all for a total cost of $40. If you want to hear the number that made the region's most respected master builder go silent and admit he'd been doing everything wrong for 40 years, stay until the end. What did this quiet outcast, this boy with no formal training, understand about heat, wind, and moisture that every experienced builder in the valley had missed? If you enjoy these stories of quiet competence, consider subscribing and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Silas wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 20-year-old former deckhand, and he was just trying to keep his family from freezing to death again. He'd been cast out by his father at 17 for a disagreement that was never spoken of again. To survive, he'd made his way to Duluth and signed on with the crews of the great ore freighters that worked the brutal waters of Lake Superior. For 3 years, his home was a steel box, surrounded by water that was often just a single degree above freezing. It was a world of relentless cold, perpetual dampness, and the constant battle against condensation. He didn't get an education in engineering. He got a practical education in thermodynamics, taught by the simple, unforgiving reality of a steel hull in icy water. He learned how moisture inside a ship would condense on the cold steel walls, creating a constant dripping misery. He learned how the shipping companies started adding cork insulation and, later, building ships with a double hull, an air gap between the inner and outer layers of steel. That gap, he saw, did two things. It provided a buffer against catastrophic damage, but more importantly for the crew, it created a zone of still air. And still air, he learned, was a powerful insulator. Moving air, or moving water, stripped heat with terrifying speed. Still air held onto it. He learned how ventilation wasn't just about fresh air. It was about managing moisture, pulling the damp air out before it could turn everything to ice or mildew. When he met and married Elspeth, a quiet girl from a nearby town, he left the lakes. They used what little money they had to buy a small plot of land and a one-room log cabin. By the standards of the frontier, it was a respectable home. It had been built a decade prior with solid logs, reasonably chinked, and a stone fireplace. Silas spent his first autumn adding a lean-to and cutting wood. He thought he was prepared. Then their first winter came. It was a brutal lesson. The wind in northern Minnesota is not a gentle breeze. It's a physical force, a relentless predator that hunts for every crack, every seam, every weak point in a shelter. The wind didn't just make the air feel colder. Silas observed that it seemed to physically pull the heat right out of the log walls. He could put his hand on the interior wall on a windy night and feel the warmth being wicked away. They burned through 5 cords of wood. He was up every 3 hours, every single night feeding the firebox. Even with the stove glowing red, the cabin rarely climbed above 45 degrees. Their daughter, little Clara, just a baby, slept in a wooden crate near the stove, bundled in every blanket they owned. Elspeth stuffed rags into the gaps along the floorboards every evening, only to find them frozen solid by morning. Frost didn't just form on the single-pane window. It crept across the interior walls, a beautiful, deadly filigree of ice. The worst part was the moisture. The wood he'd cut was green, not properly seasoned. A lot of the stove's heat, he realized, wasn't going into warming the cabin. It was being wasted boiling the water out of his own fuel. The steam went up the chimney, but it also filled the small cabin. It condensed on the cold walls, ran down in trickles, and froze. Everything felt damp. Their clothes, their bedding, the very air they breathed. It was the same miserable, unhealthy dampness he remembered from the single-hulled freighters. But here, it was his wife and child suffering. One night in late February, huddled by the stove while a blizzard shrieked outside, the insight struck him. It wasn't an academic thought. It was a connection, forged from memory and misery. Everyone here was fighting the winter the same way. They were building wooden boxes and trying to pour enough heat into them to overcome the cold that was constantly breaking in. They were fighting the air. But the air wasn't the real enemy. The wind was, and the moisture was. On the ore boats, they didn't try to heat the lake. They created a barrier against it, the double hull. They didn't ignore moisture. They managed it with ventilation. And what was the biggest, most stable thermal mass you could imagine? Not a ship's hull, but the Earth itself. 10 feet down, the ground in Minnesota stays a near constant 50 degrees year-round. It doesn't care if it's 100 above or 40 below. The Earth was a massive, free source of stable temperature, but it was also full of moisture. That's why nobody lived underground. You'd be living in a damp, cold tomb. Unless you could use the Earth's stability but defeat its moisture. Unless you could build a double hull, not with steel, but with stone, air, and wood, right into the side of a hill. His plan formed, simple and radical. He wouldn't build on the land. He would build in it. He would use the Earth as his primary insulation, and he would build a sophisticated system of air gaps and ventilation to keep the interior bone dry. He waited for the spring thaw, and as soon as the ground was soft enough, he picked his spot on a south-facing slope, and he began to dig. The opportunity to buy materials came from a railroad surplus auction. For $12, he bought a massive roll of heavy tar paper. He spent another $20 on rough-sawn lumber from a mill clearing out its odds and ends. The final $8 went to nails, a small window sash, and some cast-iron pipe for a chimney and vents. Total cost, $40. The rest would be stone from his own land and labor from his own back. The construction began with the digging. He excavated a pit 30 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 8 feet deep into the slope. This wasn't just a hole. It was a precise excavation, with the floor sloped gently to one end. Then, he laid the first layer of his defense against moisture. He dug a trench around the entire perimeter of the floor, deeper than the main level, and filled it and the entire floor with a 6-inch bed of coarse gravel he hauled from a nearby creek bed. This was his French drain, an underground channel to collect and drain away any groundwater. Next, he built the outer wall. Using field stones he cleared from his own pasture, he dry-stacked a massive retaining wall against the earthen banks of the pit. It was slow, brutal work, fitting the stones together like a giant puzzle. This stone wall would hold back the literal tons of earth, but he knew it would be cold and damp. It was only the outer hull. Now came the part that baffled everyone. Inside the stone pit, he began to build a second structure, a simple box-frame cabin made of the cheap lumber. But he didn't build it against the stone wall. He built it with a continuous 6-inch gap between the wooden frame and the stone. This was the core of his idea, the air gap, the double hull. The narrator can explain here. Now here's what made this actually brilliant. That 6-inch air gap would serve two purposes. First, it was a thermal break. The immense, stable cold of the damp earth would be stopped by that buffer of still air. Still air is a poor conductor of heat. Moving air, like the 40-mile-per-hour winds of a Minnesota blizzard, strips heat 15 to 20 times faster than still air. By keeping the air in that gap still, he was creating an invisible layer of insulation. Second, it was a moisture barrier. Any water seeping through the stone wall from the surrounding earth would hit that air gap. It would condense on the cold stone, run down the face of the wall, and be collected by the gravel French drain at the bottom, where it would be channeled harmlessly away from the foundation. The living space would never touch the damp earth. He framed the roof, then laid down a double layer of the thick tar paper, overlapping the seams meticulously. On top of this, he installed 2 ventilation pipes, a low intake near the floor on one end of the cabin, and a high exhaust near the ceiling on the other. This was his engine for keeping the air dry. Cold, dry winter air would be drawn in through the low pipe. As it warmed inside the cabin, it would rise, picking up moisture from breathing, cooking, and living. This warmer, moister air would then exit through the high exhaust pipe. It was a slow, constant, passive circulation of air. Finally, he and Elspeth spent a week shoveling the excavated earth back on top of the roof and packing it against the exposed walls, until the entire structure, except for the south-facing front, was buried under 3 feet of sod and soil. From the outside, it looked like a natural hillock, a grassy mound with a single wooden wall set into its face, containing a sturdy door and 1 small window. It looked strange. It looked small. To the neighbors, it looked like a root cellar, a burrow, a home fit for an animal, not a family. Elspeth stood back, her hands on her hips, a worried line on her brow. "Silas," she said, her voice quiet, "people are going to think we've lost our minds. They're going to think we're prairie dogs." Silas just wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and looked at the solid little structure. "Let them," he said. And when neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw poverty. They saw desperation. They saw a young man who didn't know how to build a proper home. The ridicule started before the first snow. The first to visit was Jedediah Thorne. Thorne was the valley's master builder. He ran the sawmill, had built half the cabins in the county, and carried the unassailable authority of a man who had worked with wood his entire life. He walked around the earthen mound, kicking at the sod with the toe of his boot. He peered at the exposed front wall, then asked Silas to explain the construction. Silas described the stone wall, the air gap, the inner frame. Thorne listened, his expression growing more and more grim. He finally shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "Son," he said, his voice rumbling with authority, "I admire the work you've put in, but you've made a fatal error. That gap you're so proud of, it's going to be your ruin. Moisture will get in, and with no sun and no air circulation, it'll just sit there. The space between those walls will fill with frost in the winter and stagnant water in the spring. Your whole inner frame, the house you're actually living in, will be rotten inside of 2 years. You haven't built a house, you've built a mushroom farm, a coffin." Silas listened respectfully. He didn't argue. He didn't try to explain the ventilation or the drainage. He just nodded. "Perhaps," he said, "just trying something different, Jedediah." Thorne left, shaking his head, and the story of Silas's mushroom farm spread through the valley. The most vicious jab came from Bill Souter, a loud, brawny teamster who held court at the trading post. One Saturday, with the store full, Souter saw Silas buying a few supplies. "Hey, Silas," Souter boomed so everyone could hear. "Heard you ain't building a house, you're just digging a burrow. My wife wants to know if you're storing nuts for the winter in there." A wave of laughter filled the store. Suitor, pleased with his audience, delivered the final blow. We ought to call it the Gopher Hole. The name stuck. From that day on, it was no longer Silas's place. It was the Gopher Hole. The mockery became a constant low-grade pressure. People would ride their wagons down their road for no other reason than to slow down and stare at the strange mound of earth. At church, conversations would stop when Silas and Elspeth approached. Elspeth felt it most acutely. At a quilting circle, one of the older women patted her hand and said, "Don't you worry, dear. Once he sees how cold a dirt hole is, Jedediah Thorne will help him build a proper little cabin next spring." It was meant as kindness, but it felt like a judgment on her husband's failure. Even officialdom weighed in. Mr. Harrison, the county extension agent, made a special trip out. He was a man who believed in manuals, in proven techniques published by the university. He walked the perimeter, took some notes on a clipboard, and spoke to Silas with an air of formal concern. "This is highly unconventional, Silas," he said. "There are well-documented methods for frontier construction that guarantee a certain level of performance. This isn't in any manual I've ever seen. I'm concerned about ventilation, humidity, and structural integrity." The cut that went deepest, however, came from family. Elspeth's older brother Thomas came to visit. He took Silas aside, his face a mask of fraternal concern. "Silas," he began, "I'm worried about Elspeth and the baby. People are talking. They're saying you don't know how to build a real house. That you're either too poor to afford the logs or too scared of the work. They're going to think you're incompetent. Maybe both." For the first time, a flicker of something hard passed through Silas's eyes, but his voice stayed level. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Thomas," he said quietly. "I'm trying to keep my family warm." By November, as the days grew short and the air held a permanent biting chill, not one person in the valley thought Silas had solved anything. They thought he'd built a monument to his own foolishness, a damp, dark hole in the ground they called the Gopher Hole. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Silas right. It changed how this entire valley thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1903 to 1904 is still recorded in Minnesota's climatology archives as one of the most severe of the 20th century. It wasn't just a single cold snap. It was a prolonged, brutal siege. It began on December the 8th, when the thermometer dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight and stayed there. By December 12th, it was minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. On December 18th, a massive Arctic high-pressure system settled over the region, and the temperature plunged to minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with winds that drove the chill factor below minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow came with it, but it was a dry, scouring snow, driven by the wind into drifts that buried fences and blocked roads, and it did not let up. For 26 consecutive days, the thermometer in the county seat never climbed above zero. The valley began to break. The cold was no longer an inconvenience. It was a life-threatening enemy. The suffering was universal, and it was specific. Jedediah Thorne, in his master-built two-story home, the finest in the valley, was burning through his seasoned hardwood at a terrifying rate, a cord a week. And still, his wife and children lived in the kitchen, the warmest room in the house, which held a stubborn 45 degrees. The upstairs rooms were abandoned, their windows thick with ice. Bill Souter, the man who had mocked Silas, found his own cabin's roof sagging under the weight of the snow, compressing the sod insulation and opening up new drafts. He and his family were burning nearly as much wood as Thorne, just to stay above freezing. His wife was sick with a lung-rattling cough. The Colby Ranch, A large operation on the valley floor was losing livestock. Calves, born in the frigid barns, were freezing to death within hours. The ranch hands were burning fence posts and old furniture to supplement their dwindling wood piles. Across the valley, the same stories played out. Chimneys clogged with creosote from burning green wood. Families huddled in a single room, wearing every layer of clothing they owned. The constant, exhausting labor of feeding the stove, only to watch the heat vanish into the walls. The gnawing fear of the woodpile shrinking day by day. Winter had ceased to be a season. It had become a siege. And then, people started noticing something strange about the gopher hole. A doctor, making a desperate house call on horseback, rode past Silas's place during the worst of the cold snap. The wind was a physical blow, and the air so cold it hurt to breathe. He glanced over at the mound of earth, expecting no sign of life, but he saw two things that made him slow his horse to a stop. First, the smoke coming from the chimney pipe wasn't the thick, panicked plume of a stove being fed desperately. It was a thin, lazy wisp, almost invisible against the gray sky. It was the smoke of a fire that was barely trying. Second, as he watched, the cabin door opened. Silas stepped out. He wasn't wearing a heavy coat. He wasn't wearing a hat or gloves. He was in his shirt sleeves. He walked calmly to his small, neatly stacked wood pile, picked up a few pieces of kindling, and went back inside, closing the door behind him. He had been outside for no more than a minute in minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit weather, dressed for a crisp autumn day. The doctor stared for a long moment, then spurred his horse on. The image burned into his mind. He told the story at his next stop. The story began to spread. It was impossible. It had to be a mistake. Stay with me. Because the number that came out of that mound of earth is going to defy everything you think you know about heat and cold. The breaking point for Jedediah Thorne came on December the 23rd. The temperature had bottomed out at minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit. His own woodpile was dangerously low, and he knew families with less foresight were already in desperate trouble. He loaded his sled with emergency cordwood, hitched his team, and started making deliveries. A grim-faced St. Nicholas of survival. His last stop of the day was Silas's place. He didn't expect them to be in trouble. The boy was too stubborn, but he felt a duty to check. He expected to find them huddled in misery, and he planned to offer, without judgment, a quarter cord of dry oak. He pulled his team to a halt and walked to the door, the snow crunching loudly in the dead-still, frigid air. He knocked, his gloved hand making a dull thud. The door opened. Elspeth stood there, and the first thing that happened was the warmth. It wasn't a blast of heat. It was a wave of pure, comfortable warmth that rolled out of the cabin and hit him like stepping into a different season. It was the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in his own house in weeks. He was so stunned, he took a half step back. His eyes adjusted to the lamplight inside, and then he saw it. The image that would shatter 40 years of his own certainty. Behind Elspeth, sitting at a small wooden table, was their daughter, Clara. She was playing with a wooden doll. She was wearing a simple cotton dress. In another corner, Silas sat in a chair, oiling a piece of tack. He wore a simple flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows. Not coats, not blankets, not shivering masses of wool. A man in shirt sleeves and a child in a dress. Jedediah found his voice. Elspeth, Silas. Just checking in. Everything all right? Elspeth smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. We're fine, Jedediah. We're managing fine. But thank you for stopping. Would you like to come in for a moment? He stepped inside, pulling off his hat. The warmth enveloped him. It was a deep, steady, radiant warmth. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove, but a gentle, pervasive comfort. The air was fresh and dry. There was no hint of dampness, no smell of mildew. The walls were bare wood, and they were warm to the touch. "Your woodpile looks a little small," Thorne said, probing. "It does the job," Silas replied, not looking up from his work. "We're burning less than a quarter of a cord every 2 weeks." Thorne went still. "A quarter cord? Every 2 weeks?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "Silas, I'm burning a cord a week. Bill Souter is burning more than that. People are desperate." Silas finally looked up. He just nodded. Then Thorne saw it. Hanging on a nail on the wall was a simple mercury thermometer. He'd seen them in the general store. He walked over to it, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He squinted in the dim light. The mercury was a thick, clear line. It sat, unmoving, at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in for a moment. 68 degrees. Jedediah Thorne had families on his delivery list who were celebrating if they could keep their homes at 40. He felt his own mind struggling to accept the evidence of his eyes. He turned to Silas. "Can I—" He gestured to the thermometer. Silas nodded. Thorne took it off the nail. The glass was cool, but the mercury was undeniable. 68 degrees, while outside the world was gripped by a temperature of 41 degrees below zero. That was a temperature differential of 109 degrees. It was impossible. It defied the laws of nature as he understood them. He walked back to the wall, the interior wooden wall, and laid his bare palm flat against it. It was dry, and it was warm. Not hot, just not cold. It felt like a wall in summertime. "The air gap," he breathed. "The ventilation." Silas finally stood up. He led Thorne to the corner and showed him the intake pipe near the floor. A tiny, almost imperceptible trickle of frigid outside air was being drawn in. Then he showed him the exhaust pipe near the ceiling. Holding his hand over it, Thorne could feel a faint, slow-moving current of slightly warmer air being pushed out. The house was breathing. Slowly, steadily, it was inhaling dry air and exhaling moisture. The data was irrefutable. The narrator can lay it out side by side. Jedediah Thorne's home, a master-built, 2-story cabin. Fuel consumption, 2 cords of seasoned oak per month. Average interior temperature, 45 degrees. Bill Souter's home, a standard single-room log cabin. Fuel consumption, 1.8 cords of mixed wood per month. Average interior temperature, 42 degrees. Silas's gopher hole, a $40 earth-bermed dugout. Fuel consumption, 0.5 cords of unseasoned poplar per month. Average interior temperature, 68 degrees. The difference wasn't incremental, it was categorical. Silas wasn't just doing it better, he was playing an entirely different game. Jedediah Thorne stood in the middle of that small, warm room. He looked at the child playing happily on the floor. He looked at Elspeth, sewing peacefully. He looked at the quiet, competent young man who had listened to his condescending advice and said nothing. He had mocked this boy, pitied him, dismissed him as a fool. And that fool had built the only truly civilized shelter in the entire frozen valley. Thorne turned to Silas. His voice was raw with the admission of a lifetime of error. "I've been building houses in this valley for 40 years, he said, his voice clear and steady. "We've been doing it wrong." This wasn't just about being warm. It was about dignity. It was the difference between shivering survival and comfortable life. In this small, buried cabin, a child could do schoolwork without her fingers going numb. A woman could cook a meal without wearing a heavy coat. A family could sleep through the night without waking to feed a ravenous stove. Silas's system hadn't just defeated the cold. It had turned winter from something to survive into something to live through. Word of Thorne's visit spread faster than a wildfire. When the county's most respected builder declared his own methods obsolete, people listened. A week later, after the cold had broken slightly, Mr. Harrison, the county agent, returned. This time, he brought a calibrated thermometer and a hygrometer to measure humidity. He spent an hour taking readings. He documented everything, his face a mask of professional astonishment. The numbers were confirmed. The gopher hole was officially, scientifically, impossibly successful. Silas, it turned out, had kept meticulous records in a small ledger, daily high and low temperatures inside and out, and a precise accounting of wood consumed. This wasn't luck. It was data. It was engineering. By the time the thaw came in April, half the valley knew something impossible was happening in that mound of earth on Silas's land, and they wanted to understand it. The first to adopt the new method was the Colby family, who had lost a third of their new calves in the Great Freeze. They were practical people, pushed to the edge by their losses. That spring, Silas didn't give them lectures. He gave them his time. He spent 2 weeks helping them and their ranch hands excavate and build a much larger, rougher version of his home, not for people, but as a calving barn. They used bigger stones, thicker timbers, but the same principles: the gravel drain, the stone retaining wall, the air gap, the insulated inner wall, and the passive ventilation. The following winter was a normal one, with temperatures dropping to a familiar -20 degrees Fahrenheit. But while the other ranchers struggled to keep their barns above freezing with hay bales and heaters, the Colbys' new earth-sheltered barn held a steady 45 degrees Fahrenheit with no supplemental heat at all, just the body heat of the animals. They didn't lose a single calf. The Silas method, as it was now called, had been proven replicable. The idea spread. That summer, 5 more families built earth-bermed homes. 12 the summer after that. Jedediah Thorne himself, in an act of profound humility, supervised the construction of 3 of them, teaching the principles he had once mocked. He told people Silas hadn't just built a better cabin, he'd shown them a better way to think about shelter. Mr. Harrison, the extension agent, wrote a detailed bulletin for the State Agricultural Service, complete with diagrams Silas had drawn on butcher paper. It was titled, Principles of Subterranean Dwelling and Passive Air Circulation for Northern Climates. It was distributed across Minnesota, Wisconsin, and the Dakotas. The gopher hole became a local legend. What Silas had built in 1903 using intuition learned on ore freighters and $40 of surplus material. Anticipated by nearly a century, what building scientists would rediscover and call passive house design. He had created a super-insulated airtight thermal envelope with a heat recovery ventilation system. He just used stone, dirt, air, and wood. Years later, when he was an old man and his strange cabin had become a landmark, a young newspaper reporter came to ask him how he'd come up with such a revolutionary idea. Silas was sitting on his porch, looking out over the valley. He considered the question for a long time. "Wasn't revolutionary," he finally said, his voice quiet. "The earth is warm and the wind is cold. The ground is wet and the air inside gets wet. I just tried to keep the one and get rid of the others. This isn't new. It's just correct." The original structure, its walls reinforced with concrete by his sons, still stands. A gentle, grassy knoll on the old homestead, a silent monument to a quiet truth. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition for their own sakes. It didn't care about what people thought or what things looked like. It rewarded what worked. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for one new story of proven frontier technique every single week. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of survival engineering. The characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized for narrative purposes, but the building principles are based on real historical practices of earth-sheltered construction and passive ventilation.